As long as there's been heavy metal, there's been Black Sabbath. In 1970, the band's legendary debut with its massive riffs and haunting album cover changed the look and sound of rock and roll forever. Their 19 albums feature a who's who of iconic vocalists: Ozzy Osbourne, Ian Gillan, Glenn Hughes, and the late, great Ronnie James Dio. For almost 50 years, Black Sabbath has continued to carry the torch for this dark and heavy music. But this month, metal's founding fathers have played their final show. Could this really be the end? Even as guitarist Tony Iommi hints there may be more Black Sabbath to come, we take a good look back and ask, what's the best Sabbath album? Best lineup? Best era? And what's up with that Dio hologram? Today on Lock Horns, we debate the biggest metal band of all time, the mighty Black Sabbath. Welcome back to Lock Horns, Banger TV's weekly live metal debate show. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. We're gunning for the 100,000 subscriber mark. Well, you guessed by the intro, we're digging into something pretty special this week. And given that this band shows signs of calling it quits, possibly forever, we are tackling, yes, the most important metal band of all time. The reason why all of us are even here in the first place, that of course is Black Sabbath. And to help me with this is the guy who's written more books than I can even count, Martin Popoff.
How you doing, Sam?
Buddy?
Yes.
Welcome back
looking forward to
the studio, resident expert, and I dare you to go toe-to-toe on Sabbath with this guy. You've written a few books on Sabbath.
Yep.
Tell me about those.
Well, the first one was called Doom Let Loose, an illustrated Black Sabbath history. It's out of print now for a little while. It's kind of neat. It's a collectible book now. Black Sabbath FAQ, part of the FAQ series of a U.S. publisher, and it's 140,000 words of super trivia. I've done an Aussie coffee table book, in terms of the family, 4 Deep Purple books, Rainbow, Dio. It's basically all covered. So
amazing, pretty impressive.
Love the Sabbath.
So why write so many books about this one band?
Well, they are the most important band, and as we will find out, they had many lineups. They've gone through many phases. They sound like completely different bands the whole time. So they just have this massive history. And as you mentioned, they are basically the most important band. They are the first heavy metal band by pretty much consensus.
Very cool. Well, I mean, we all have our own stories of how we got into Sabbath, remembering those very first moments. To me, it was a bit of a backtrack, of course, because when I was a teenager, what really hit me were bands like Metallica and Maiden and Slayer and Judas Priest and on, and then I went back and discovered, the band that started it all. But for you, do you remember the moment you got into this band?
Yeah, I would say I was 9 years old, 1972. I know my first Sabbath album that I ever bought was Volume 4, and as the code of the kids of the 70s, you're supposed to really plump for your first album, but I'm not going to pick that as my favorite, but that was my first. I remember the scary, creepy cover of Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. That was pretty nuts, but I do have a distinct memory. In grade 4, we were allowed to either play DJ or show and tell, and I remember going in and playing DJ and playing Volume 4 in grade 4.
Just think of that.
Class.
Do classes still do that? Can you go in, do DJ or show and tell, and pull out Volume 4? 9 years old, people. This is some pedigree. Well done. Okay, so enough from us. You know how this works. The goal today is to determine the best Black Sabbath albums of all time. So roll up your sleeves. You know how to do it. We don't want to just hear what those albums are, but we also want to hear why. Give us your opinion. That's what Lock Horns is all about. So let's give a shout out to everyone that's joining us today. We've got people from Sweden, England, Norway, Amsterdam, Romania, Lithuania, Portugal, Brazil, Ecuador, Venezuela, Chile, Laredo, I think that's Texas, Miami, Springville, Spokane, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, and in the Great White North, we got folks from Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. So no surprise, Sabbath is a band that reaches everyone around the globe. To help us with the proceedings is, of course, Lisa Ladisor. Welcome.
I'm still here. I never get to leave.
She's rocking an amazing glove.
Oh.
This is a special feature. We're making it black for the mighty Black Sabbath. Okay, so let's get into this a little bit. Let's start with a little bit of an overview. Black Sabbath. Can you give us a little mini history?
Sure. Okay, so they started in 1968, very quickly got going. They're from Birmingham. They got a deal with Vertigo. They got their first album out, monumental album. Its birthday was just 2 days ago, February 13th. So 1970, they came out with this album that's considered the first heavy metal album of all time. They moved through the 70s. They make 8 albums. It's Ozzy, Geezer, Bill, and Tony for all that period. They're successful right out of the gates. They're on Warner Brothers over here. And they hit a few road bumps later on. Yeah. You know, the albums from the end of the 70s don't do so well. They're kind of seen as has-been. It's the time of punk. Mm-hmm. Ozzy's kind of kicked out of the band. There's drinking problems. They're all doing a lot of drugs. Ronnie James Dio comes in. They make this stellar Heaven and Hell album. Does great. Goes platinum. They do Mob Rules with Ronnie. Mm-hmm. Ronnie, of course, is Ronnie James Dio. He came from Rainbow. He's an American. So they do that. Then egos kind of start happening. They put out a live album. Then Sabbath kind of hits the dumpers. Dio's doing well. Ozzy's doing well. You know, all the ex-singers are doing great. Sabbath, unfortunately, shifting lineups all over the place. They do a bizarre album that a lot of people love with Ian Gillan called Born Again, 1983. Then it's like Glenn Hughes is in the band. There's still, you know, drugs and coke is talked about and people coming in and out and there's no money and none of these records are doing well. Tony Martin comes in the band. Another English guy, he's kind of like considered a baby version of Ronnie James Dio. They put out some albums. The Eternal Idol's a great album. They do Headless Cross, which does pretty well over in Europe. They get back together with Ronnie James Dio again and do Dehumanizer, 1992. Yeah. Then there's a couple other Tony Martin albums, and nobody likes them. They're just considered really crappy albums. Mm-hmm. And they close that out with It's Forbidden and Cross Purposes. And then you enter this period where basically they don't exist, but we're getting into the Ozfest era, and I can never remember like who's headlining. Was it Ozzy one year or was it Sabbath one year? But it's basically the reunion version of the band. They do a live album off of Ozfest called Reunion. This is like all 4 original members, but they don't make a record. So they keep kind of reforming and not being reformed over and over. Then there's this little wrinkle in the fabric where they have Ronnie James Dio comes back and they form a band and they call it Heaven and Hell, even though it's the exact lineup with Vinny Appice, Ronnie, Geezer, and Tony. And they make a full album called The Devil You Know. And then they kind of close it out with Ozzy coming back, but no Bill Ward, and there's all that controversy around why isn't Bill Ward back? Is it his health? Can he drum that hard for that length of time? So there was a lot of bad blood going on around there. But they make a record called 13, produced by Rick Rubin. Brad Wilk from Rage Against the Machine is the drummer. And they tour. They do this massive tour, and now they've just done the farewell tour, and they closed it off in Birmingham, and they say that's going to be it. It was just like a week or 10 days ago, I believe. And so now we're at this point where nobody knows what's going to happen, but it really does feel like the end. They're pretty old guys at this point.
Well, I warned you. You're not going to go toe-to-toe with this guy. I dare you. Yeah, it's a very fascinating story, without question, and a catalog that is very, very deep and has had a lot of impact on all of us. And obviously, there's a lot of records to choose from here. And I think, like most bands, there's usually 2, maybe 3 records that most people find to be the most impactful, the most resonant with themselves personally, but we always like to kick things off with a guest's choice. Sure. And you've chosen something a little off the radar, if you will.
Yeah, well, glad to do that. I mean, I'm always a big supporter of Sabotage. I mean, another one of my favorite records of all time is Physical Graffiti, and always, you know, there's always that Zeppelin versus Sabbath thing. I always say Sabbath was able to do it with one record that it took Led Zeppelin 2 records to do with Physical Graffiti, same year. But this is
why Sabotage?
Oh, this is just a great classic epic album. Great recording. You could tell they're like really like it's almost like white knuckle. They're having big money problems, management problems, a lot of drugs going around. Very excessive album, good recording, but it's got these long epic songs that are all really cool. Megalomania is like 11 minutes long. Symptom of the Universe is like a song often considered the first thrash song in certain ways, this really drilling riff. Super Desire, which is this massive kind of choral, strange, evil classical music thing. Just great songs, Hole in the Sky, The Writ. It's just a really well-placed and super creative, complicated, almost like it's the one where it feels like they're geniuses.
Right. Well, I mean, we'll get into this, but I think a lot of people forget as we just repeat the line, this is the first heavy metal band, this is the band that set the template for so much music. We do forget often how diverse their albums are, even going back to their very first records. We talked earlier about there's a lot of blues, a lot of jazz, a lot of psychedelic creeping in, obviously keyboards enter the story fairly early on, so I'm sure we'll get into those aspects of Sabbath's sound as we move forward. Okay. Here we go. We're going to dig into the audience. Lisa, help me out here.
Well, there's a lot of comments so far. People like your shirts.
Good start.
Very cool.
For
Excellent.
both of you gentlemen. Prague Ludwig says, Martin Popoff doesn't read Wikipedia. Wikipedia reads him.
Whoa! Snap.
So everyone's up to speed now on the Sabbath history, and we do have mostly consensus about your choice.
Okay, here we go. Daniel Nee, or Kuni, says Sabotage is the most perfect album from start to finish. Jack Ryan, Black Sabbath Sabotage are the golden years. Michael L. Krusty, Sabotage says, no, come on. Chiseled in Stone says, Sabotage is my personal favorite too. Not the best one though. And Stacy Funk, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath and Sabotage were too trippy for me. I had to be peaking to listen to those, but in a certain state of mind, they are great albums. And Stacy Funk, you are one of many that have peaked during many Sabbath records, so you're not alone there. So yeah, you're getting a little bit of love there,
Good, yeah.
but you know,
Good to hear.
This is in the center of the dartboard. I think for most people, speaking of the center of the dartboard, Lisa, where are people going here?
So I've been reading the chat all day. Shout out to those people who join us like hours in advance, get this party started. And the consensus seems to be, at this point, Paranoid and Master of Reality are really the two records to talk about as the #1 album.
Okay, well, let's see what people have to say, and then we'll get into it here.
Okay.
Paranoid versus Master of Reality. This is the toe-to-toe. This is the head-to-head, how we're kicking things off today. Horror Master, one of the Four Horsemen. Yes? Are the Four Horsemen riding today?
They are
riding. They are. They're out there. Paranoid has to be the Legend album. This was the album that defined the metal sound. Thesis statement, probably for a lot of people. Heavy Metal Heretic, the first album, invented metal. Master of Reality invented doom and sludge. However, Paranoid defined the very sound of classic metal. A perfect album, maybe the greatest in metal history. I don't think you would get a lot of detractors on that. Chiseled in Stone says, Paranoid is the quintessential Black Sabbath album. It is all the great songs. Iron Man, the title track, Hand of Doom, Electric Funeral, Fairies Wear Boots. The album is 5-star. And Leonard Reibstein says, the definitive Black Sabbath album is Master of Reality. We start with an ode to weed and sweet leaf, and then alternate between meaty metal cuts and moody bliss. Oh, and it's true. It's a true album instead of just a collection of songs. This isn't to say the record doesn't have standout tunes. Children of the Grave, total banger, one of my personal favorites from the Sabbath catalog. Paranoid's got the singles, even the B-sides are singles on that. But I'd argue that Master of Reality is an album dynamic, though, as much a better album. Here we go, there's more. Zachary, music guy, says they should have called that album Into the Void and some other stuff. Just kidding, that's my fave Sab album because of Into the Void as one of my favorite guitar sounds of all time. So grimy and doomy, dope stuff. VTX, for me, Sabbath's #1 is Paranoid. It just has everything for a perfect start. The first album is strong too, but missing a little something. And in the end, and in the same year, the second just had it all, in my opinion. Delicious Dishes, one of the Four Horsemen.
He is, and he gets the last word here.
Here we go. The only problem with Paranoid is that damn ugly cover. Okay? After they had an amazing one for the debut, totally agree, one of the best of all time. How did that happen? Okay, catch our breath.
Okay.
Weigh in here, Mr. Popoff.
Okay.
Talk about these two albums.
Okay. Master of Reality is my second favorite Sabbath album, probably. I just love this album. I love the extreme production on it. I would say I think it's 5 of the heavy songs. They're absolutely all classics. I love Lord of This World. After Forever is a great song. Sweet Leaf, Children of the Grave, Into the Void. They're all great. I even love the mellow, dirgy things on it. There's really one song, Solitude, on there, and then the other two are kind of intros.
Right.
Just love this album, think it's amazing, think it's a big step up. Paranoid, I'm definitely not a Paranoid guy. I actually think this is down the list quite a bit. I find it clanky, only like a slight improvement over the first album. To me, War Pigs is really the standout track, but there is some really jammy stuff on there. Fairies Wear Boots, I never liked very much.
Right.
Rat Salad. I find Paranoid, there's a bit of a problem in that it's like when you have to argue with Led Zeppelin for the
Right.
best Zeppelin album. You're just so sick of it you can't pick it,
So
right?
Martin
But I find it
Popoff-
cold and clanky.
Forever the contrarian and iconoclast, claiming that Paranoid is cold and clanky. You know, it's interesting. Leading into today's show, I spent some time listening to these records, and in my head, Master of Reality was always my favorite, and I think to a large extent it still is. I think it juxtaposes that sort of ethereal, cerebral element to Sabbath, which, as heavy as they've been, they've always had that element to their sound with some real crushing tunes. And then I listened to Paranoid, I'm like, I forgot that like 3/4 of this record contains some of the most memorable metal songs of all time. So you're kind of into this sort of populism versus musical integrity, musical depth kind of argument with these two records.
See,
Difficult
this
to
went
say.
4 times platinum as well.
Right.
It's their biggest seller. This
Absolutely.
went 2 times platinum. It's their second
Right.
biggest seller, and they got some platinums and a bunch of gold. So,
And-
so that's their moving pictures, right?
To call a spade, I mean, if you're like us and you spend a lot of time with these records, over time we may be gravitating to albums that are a little less obvious.
Yeah.
You know, if you've heard Paranoid a million times, but not of your own choice, but you start digging into the other records, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, fucking amazing.
Yeah.
You find a lot more to Sabbath. Yes, Lisa.
They have a long career, and we're going to move on,
Okay.
but not until we see that the chat has a strong opinion on which of these two albums comes out on top.
Okay, Do the Math says Master of Reality, it's got the Doom song, the Melancholic song, the Stoner song. Yes, to that, I think there's greater musical depth and breadth on this record, no question. Shark Crusher 13, another problem with Paranoid. Rat Salad, what an ugly instrumental. Good point. I think they started to kind of hone that craft. By the third record. Oliver Grunseis says that Paranoid is a little bit overrated in my opinion. It's just the most accessible, true. And Vessel Brokius says that Master of Reality was also the album of which they played most songs on their Goodbye tour. That's an interesting point. Speaks volumes about how good it is. So maybe there's sort of some timelessness in this record that we aren't properly recognizing. It's true. This is by and large, a much more straightforward, much more singular, maybe much more linear record. Lisa, what does that mean? What does this all mean?
It means people really love Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
They have a lot to say. The chat is really great.
I don't know. I'm going to wager that judging so far by the commentary and maybe the mood in the room, if you will, is that I think possibly Master of Reality may be the front runner.
I would love that. That would be
So
very
we're going to
cool.
just move those down. We're going to do a little shuffling of the deck here.
Shuffle it up.
So, if you love Paranoid and it's your favorite Black Sabbath album of all time, speak your mind. But I think people are saying that as time has passed, this one perhaps has a little more staying power and a little more to offer over the long term. Because it was a fucking long time ago that this record came out. So, where are we going next then?
We're going a little bit backwards, a little bit forward. We need to cover the breadth of the Ozzy era.
Okay.
The early albums. It wasn't just these three, right? So we have a lot of comments here on the self-titled, on Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and on Volume 4.
Okay, we'll go to the board, and then Martin, I want to get your opinion. So here we go. Self-titled record, the very first, eponymous Black Sabbath, 1970. Delicious Dishes says, first album is great for the title track, but the problem is how little metal is in there. Thrashman, Hello from Bristol. It's all about the debut, specifically the opener, the true birth of heavy metal right there. Bristol has one of the best metal bars in the world, the Griffin. Check it out if you're ever in town. Thrash Maniac 99, for my money, the essential Sabbath would be the first album, Black Sabbath. All of the songs were consistent, not to mention without this album, there is no metal. And Oliver Grunseis says the first album is the most haunting record of all time. It has a place on the board. So, Martin, give me your thoughts on the debut.
Well, again, I find it a little bit bluesy, jammy. It's got a 10-minute long song they didn't even write called "The Warning." It's got some great metal on there with The Wizard, NIB, and Black Sabbath. It is the album that invents heavy metal. It is February 13th, 1970. Nothing before this. You know, you might want to pick out a couple of Stooges albums or Blue Cheer albums or Kick Out the Jams by MC5, but this was a big change. This was Doom, the Diablos in Musica. You know, this was a scary album with a scary cover. So it's great for that reason, but it is definitely quite old sounding, just the same way I sort of consider Paranoid.
And to a point someone made on the board, I mean, you get that opening track, but after that, a lot of this album has a very different feel. I think it's fair to say it certainly gave birth to a genre, but through and through, it's not a metal album. I think that's fair to say. And after all, we are here because we are talking about metal. So let's move on. So that's the self-titled debut. And Lisa, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath.
There's really not a lot of talk about this record. This interesting comment here from Connor Kevaney, sorry if I got your name wrong. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, undisputably the most interesting Sabbath record. My mom uses the word interesting to describe salads she doesn't like. Well, that was interesting. So I don't know if this is getting any love, this record.
Okay, I gotta weigh in here. Connor, I'm with you. Are we alone here? I think Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is actually one of the best Sabbath records of all time. The title track, Killing Yourself to Live, and National Acrobat. I think there's some great songwriting on this record, and I think here they seem to be hitting some sort of stride in terms of being able to balance the heavy and the more folky, more psychedelic albums that they've produced prior. I mean, certainly Volume 4 had all those elements. It's a little light in the loafers for me. Changes. Ugh, hate that song. But Sabbath Bloody Sabbath strikes a nicer balance for me. Ben Fitz, come on people, help me out, is the album that showed heavy metal could be much more than a collection of riffs and creepiness. What do you think about this record?
Well, I would put it almost tied for my second favorite with Master of Reality. It is a little proggy. It's textured. I love that about it. To me, the arrangements really pick up. The arrangements here are much cooler than on Volume 4 and certainly the first two, and even this one. Although this has a crazy production sound, but I do love the progginess and the drugginess of it and the variety. And it's got some just great heavy songs on it. So a lot of deep fans do pick this as their favorite. This or Sabotage.
And
they
it
kind of go
is,
together.
without question, I will not take any detractors on this, the best Sabbath album cover of all time.
Crazy album cover.
And of story. Okay, so there we got the first three and a little bit more. We're going to go to a clip, or am I jumping the gun?
You're not jumping the gun because we are going to a clip. We went through the Banger Vault and we found a few interesting things to say about Black Sabbath Volume 4 from Geezer Butler himself and Tom Warrior, actually.
Can you describe to me, give me your sense of how you think the band's sound was starting to change as compared to those earlier records?
Well, we didn't want to just stick to the same old thing, you know. I mean, we thought after Master of Reality, we wanted to branch out and to get a bit of a different sound, and we were experimenting. We buying keyboards and stuff like that. So, and Tony was getting good at playing the piano, and we just wanted to experiment a bit more. And we took a lot longer to write and record albums by this time. So it gave us a chance to, you know, just experiment in the studio, and there was trying to get different sounds out of things and to make it much more of an enjoyable experience in the studio. Because up until then, we'd had like 2 days on the first album, 5 days on Paranoid, a week on Master of Reality. So we were just like, it was just another gig to us. We'd go in, play, and then go out, you know, go back on the road. So by the time Volume 4, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, we thought, well, you know, let's spend a bit more time in the studio and experiment a bit more. And we had enough money by then to be able to, you know, not be on the road, to be able to go into a studio and spend more time.
I discovered hard rock when I was 10 years old. And in 1975, when I was 12 or 13, I discovered Black Sabbath, Blue Oyster Cult, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, that kind of hard rock. Mm-hmm. And it completely changed my mind when I first heard Volume 4, which was my first Black Sabbath album. I have found yet another world where I could withdraw into and I could completely identify with. And that one proved to be the most the strongest one of all. It's extremely dark. It has what you nowadays would call almost a sludge sound. The production is very dirty. And you know, nowadays that's kind of normal. There's a million doom bands. In 1975, when I first heard that on a tape, I had never ever heard anything like that. It was utterly dark. I mean, it was a bottomless pit, that music, and I identified with that from the very first second I heard that. It was magic. It's very difficult to bring this across in mere words. It was an extension of me. It was my soul basically reproduced in music.
Well, there you go. We've got Geezer himself and the almighty Tom Warrior from Celtic Frost weighing in on Volume 4. And we're getting some love for the record from the board as well. Andrew Williams, it's an incontestable fact that the first 6 albums are cast iron classics. However, for me, it's Volume 4, followed closely by Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. They are works of art, adding texture and variety to the definition of metal and heavy rock. Vessel Bruckhuis says, love Volume 4. It's the musical embodiment of their coke addiction. Powerful, anxious at the same time. I think there might be some other drugs creeping in there that cause them to slow down. But anyway, Chiseled in Stone said Volume 4 is by far their most boring. For the most part, all the songs sound the same. Changes is the most cringeworthy song they ever wrote. I would have to agree. Shark Crusher 13, Volume 4 just does not hit it for me. It's got some awesome songs like Supernaut is fucking awesome, and Snowblind. But other than that, it is clearly outmatched by its brethren. Zachary Nathanson, my favorite Sabbath album is Volume 4. It was a diverse album because they were moving into a new direction using the mellotron and classical music, which is evidenced on Changes and Laguna Sunrise. Your thoughts on Volume 4?
Yeah, you know, I was never a huge fan of it. I mean, coming after, you know, this Master of Reality felt like it was just like a big gauzy warm production, like a big doom quilt almost sort of thing. And this is kind of like the coke addiction comment is good because it has sort of a seething hyper sort of sound to it. It's a cool production. It was made in California, and they did spend a lot of time on it, a lot more time than the previous albums, which were the typical old in England, you know, get it in, get out as fast as you can, get back on tour.
Yep.
But I also agree that there's an element of the song sort of sounding the same, and there's really no huge classics that really fall out of the album.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a hard record to love. I also find it a little bit cold, not so much as cold and clanky as the first and the second one, but it would be 4th, 5th, 6th down my list.
Well, to step back a bit, you know, this is a band with a massive catalog. I'm almost seeing that, you know, Master of Reality and Paranoid are sort of the core of the first wave of Sabbath, if you will. And I think what we're seeing is Volume 4 and Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, are kind of the core of the second wave, that kind of maturing sound. For me, I do love Volume 4, but I think that Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath is where they're starting to really kind of refine and do a better job of incorporating all those elements. You mentioned off camera like a prog element to this album, and I think they're figuring out how to add all these elements, how to use all that time in the studio and nail the songs a little bit better. It's almost like a Revolver kind of Sgt. Pepper analogy, if you will. Yes, Lisa.
We need to move on because that's what we do here on Lock Hands. We try to get a lot crammed into our 45-minute show, and moving on means moving on to the next singer and talking about Dio.
Okay, well, Ronnie James Dio, obviously pretty important part of the Sabbath story, as Martin highlighted at the outset, joining on for that seminal 1980 record, Heaven and Hell. Let's see what the board has to say about Heaven and Hell. Jeff Stokes, how you doing, buddy? For my money, any and all Dio incarnations of Sabbath are the true spirit of the band. Ever heard Ozzy sing Dio Sabbath songs? Terrible. On the other hand, Dio could sing all Sabbath tracks, including Ian Gillan and Tony Martin, and sing them very well. I do have tremendous respect for the early years. It almost seems like two different bands. I still stand firm that the Dio era was far superior to all others. Fighting words here on the boards. Let's move on. Tiago Queridos says that from Black Sabbath to Sabotage, we talk about the defining moments that turned them into the founding fathers. Besides that, I really think Heaven and Hell is their best album ever? Not sure. However, I do put it on the same table as the ones we said before when it comes to history. Philip Popescu says, Heaven and Hell is the best Sabbath album. The sound quality is top tier. We're getting into a more leaner, metallic. That album sounds very different than their previous ones. The lyrics are great. Dio rules. Tony Sonos are put on 11. Do the Math says no Ozzy, no Black Sabbath. Any important, successful, prolific metal band that changes their singer should always change their name. Ooh. Echoes of Sepultura here. Luis Lima says the most important albums are their first 4 or 5. The best album is Heaven and Hell. My metal of choice is power metal. Every single power metal album has a Heaven and Hell moment. Dun, 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 ba-da-da. Artur Felipe Castana says Ozzy is the voice of Black Sabbath, but after the Ozzy era, Heaven and Hell has to be my favorite album. I mean, you had the Dio vocals. What more there is to explain in this album, I think, brought a new life after Ozzy left. Stacey Funk says, I love Dio in Rainbow, and I loved him solo, but he'll never be on the greatest Sabbath record. His albums just don't compare. Heaven and Hell was good, but it's not 69 to 79 good. Okay, weigh in. Heaven and Hell.
Well, okay, so it is the one album, you know, unarguably from this point forward that many, you know, almost anybody considers a classic album. I agree that it is almost sounds like the work of a different band. Martin Birch is producing. He does that one and Mob Rules. Mm-hmm. It is a shiny, sleek, efficient sound. Mm-hmm. I've always, you know, it's a great album. I love it. But there's always just a little bit of like they're becoming to be a little self-aware. They're now kind of not. It's not about just spontaneity and art at this point. They seem to be kind of second-guessing things a little bit, and I think that's represented a little bit by Ronnie taking over the lyrics from Geezer. I prefer the Geezer lyrics. They seemed more universal and emotional and strange and just brave and willing to go all over the place. Ronnie's lyrics were getting into that little bit, you know, evil woman, Dungeons and Dragons kind of feel, and I'm not crazy about that about the album. But it is a great uniform album. You know, everything kind of sounds the same. It's more or less arranged all the same, and it's great. I mean, it was a huge success. As we were saying before, it went platinum, and you know, it represents the next generation of Sabbath fans. Like there would be people younger than us who would swear by that record as the best one and just say the old stuff is just a bunch of hippie music.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point that maybe we're talking about two different bands here. Yeah. Not just because there's a different vocalist, but we have such a tremendous shift in production and riffing, and the whole feel of the album is miles apart from the early records. I mean, in the pro column, here's a band that has had 2 of the best metal singers of all time, and Dio steps in, and you know, Ozzy has great character and has stood the test of time, but Ronnie James Dio had pipes that no one could really compete with. Lisa.
Absolutely.
I don't ever want to cut off Sam Dunn talking about Ronnie James Dio.
It's easy to do, though, because I talk a lot.
I know. I really don't want to, but I might suggest that the chat thinks there's another record more important than Heaven and Hell to this era.
Okay.
But I love this comment first from Eddie McAdies.
Eddie McAdies. Dio era Sabbath is like Star Trek, The Next Generation. In many ways it's superior, but will never be recognized as the original. Good analogy.
Yeah.
Anyway, lots more to get through, Lisa, right? We're going to move on. We got to move at a not a snail's pace.
That's the Doom Show.
Yeah, at a thrash pace here. No mention of Mob Rules, interestingly, but let's park that for the moment. Or are they out there?
Not much.
Okay.
But there's a lot of love for Dehumanizer.
Okay. Let me get Mob Rules on there, because why? It's another cover that I happen to really love from Sabbath.
Sam Dunn, pulling rank.
Pulling rank. It's on there just because I want to see it, because I like looking at it. Dehumanizer? Is that what I hear? Here we go.
Yeah.
Dehumanizer. Austin Hornbeck says Dehumanizer may be the heaviest Sabbath record of all time. Both are quintessential metal albums that have stood the test of time. Michael Magill, Dehumanizer for me. Michael Perosi says Dehumanizer is absolutely the heaviest Sabbath album ever. The Dehumanizer tour with Dio, it was the greatest Sabbath tour ever, and I've seen them dozens of times since 1979. Well done, Michael. And Moses Garner says Dehumanizer is a brilliant album. It was just overlooked because it came out when grunge was the flavor of the month. Give us some context here for Dehumanizer.
Well, yeah, it's kind of strange. I mean, I would personally think that most Sabbath fans I know would pick Mob Rules way over Dehumanizer, and a lot of them would even forget Dehumanizer happened. I'm not a big Dehumanizer fan either. It's 1992. It's Ronnie kind of seems to take over the band and point it in his slow phase. He became slow around Lock Up the Wolves, Strange Highways, and he remained slow to the end of his career. Even the Heaven and Hell album was slowish. So this is a very slow, dirty, grungy album. It is pretty heavy, but I also find it kind of boring. It doesn't really take off. I love Mob Rules. To me, Mob Rules and Heaven and Hell go together like Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets. They're these two great albums. One is the son of the other. With Metallica, it might be a little different. People would say Master is maybe the masterpiece, but here it's definitely Mob Rules is almost as good as Heaven and Hell. But Dehumanizer, I swear, I think a lot of people like almost forget it.
But I think, again, we've become so intimately familiar with these catalogs, and we know these albums like the back of our hands, and we start to reach for something new, a new narrative, if you will, on this band. But I would agree with you, without getting into the weeds, it doesn't match up in my opinion. Lisa?
Well, here at Loghorn's Mob Rules, chat rules, and they like that record.
All right.
Sorry, guys.
I'm glad I put it on the board. But I'm seeing a name up here that we haven't got to yet.
Right. You know who else they like? Tony Martin.
Okay, Tony Martin era. Here we go. Roy Robichaud says, honestly, the era that gets overlooked, and it's a damn shame, is the Tony Martin era. He made some great albums. Tony had an amazing voice, and it's a shame that people lock in on the Ozzy era and ignore this. In fact, next to Dio, he is the best singer they've had. Side note, I think it has something to do with when you come into the Sabbath catalog, how old you are, all those factors. We haven't talked about that. Anyway, Andrew Dixon says, Headless Cross is a masterpiece. It's a great, great song. Tony Martin is the greatest singer on the planet. Okay, some serious love here. Altar, Trinity, Fang. Nobody ever talks about those Tony Martin gems. Love Ozzy and Dio, but let Tony get some credit. Fair enough. And DGN4369. That rolls off the tongue. I listened to Headless Cross today for the first time in about 5 years. That album is so goddamn good. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going contrarian again because I actually think Headless Cross is really overrated. I mean, there was some excitement around the band for that record, and and the later Tony Martin albums. I mean, almost nobody I know is gonna pick Cross Purposes or Forbidden as a great album, especially Tear. Tear is not a great album either, but. Myself and a lot of my buddies who liked the Tony Martin stuff, and I do quite like it. For some reason, the first one, The Eternal Idol, is the one that it almost seems like all the great songs were packed onto that very first one, and then they had run out of steam and ideas for the following ones. I agree Tony's a great singer, but he's never going to come out of the shadows of Ronnie James Dio. He phrases and vocalizes and melodicizes exactly like Ronnie. I mean, he really sounds like Ronnie through all those records.
Well, not going to get into the weeds on this one. I have no bone in this fight, as they say. Stacy Funk says, I must disagree with the Tony Martin era. Sabbath went from defining a genre to a follower of said genre less than 10 years later. I think that's kind of what you're saying. Maybe starts around Heaven and Hell. Maybe they're following rather than leading at this point because there's a new game in town. Maiden. Metallica's around the corner. Priest and on. I digress. Where am I? Must agree with the Tony Martin era. Sabbath went from defining a genre to following said genre less than 10 years later. It's that they were trying to be fashionable and failing. Late 80s and 90s era Sab was really a sore sight to watch if you were actually a fan. Okay, thanks for your honest thoughts. Homero Olvera says, Tony Martin, criminally underrated. He was my favorite era, but I also love Tony Martin, and 7th star with Glenn Hughes. Glenn! Although there's a special place in my heart for Ian's Born Again. Can't name a favorite. Ugh. So
yeah, Born Again's an amazing album, and that's a crazy, it's odd. The big story about that is how ugly the album cover is and how ugly the production is.
Love the album cover.
Ian Gillan is the singer. It doesn't make sense at all, but they're just partying, drinking, having a good time. He writes kind of silly, strange lyrics for the band, but it is a heavy, kind of really dirty. extreme kind of record, and it is the one after Heaven and Hell that a lot of people, you know, when they're in a fighting mood to pick something obscure from all the rest of the years, they're going to pick Born Again.
We're always in a fighting mood in Lockhorn, so let's keep going. Moses Garner. I would listen to Born Again a lot more if the production wasn't so shitty. The songs are great, but the production ruins it. I like the bootleg of the demos 10 times more than the actual release. It's like Injustice for All with the bass in it. Have you heard Injustice for Newstead? I digress. Louis Lima Lima. The most underrated album would be The Eternal Idol. Both versions, Gillan and Martin, sound gothic and dark. I'm not a guitar player, but to me, Tony Iommi's solos are more complex and diverse. The production sounds amazing. Rock and roll. Okay, we got it all. Will Jenkins. In the UK, the Tony Martin albums were loved as the others. Seventh Star with Glenn Hughes is another, though Forbidden should remain forbidden. Maybe that's the quote of the week. Turn a phrase there. So there you go. I mean, let's step back. We've covered, a Sabbath in an hour. How do you really do it? But I think what's clear is that there are distinct periods to the catalog. You've got the early period, you've got the sort of mid, more proggy, broader instrumentation, and then you've got this, then obviously the Dio albums introduce a leaner, more metallic, much more modern sound and approach to songwriting. And then, of course, not to cast everything else into the sort of the other category, but, you know, following those Dio albums, you really have a rotating door, if you will, of vocalists. And when that happens, if you have rotating door of a principal songwriter or a lead vocalist, often that just creates this kind of album by album rhythm, and there's not really any cohesion. Anyway, Lisa, where are we going next?
We're almost wrapping up here, but I think you guys need to do some shuffling.
Okay.
Based on our chat so far.
All right.
What is the top five?
What is the top five so far? Well, I think we would have to say that both Master of Reality and Paranoid probably belong. I think we'd probably have to say, I don't know, it's against my opinion, but I think there's more love on the board for Sabbath Volume 4 over Sabbath Plays Sabbath. Oh, it hurts. I'm not going to be able to sleep at night. I think there's a lot of love for Heaven and Hell. And there's a lot of love for this record. So far, I would argue that those are the five. Very Swiss of us. We're covering the catalog. We're literally covering over 20 years of the Sabbath catalog here, which is impressive.
If we want to be super Swiss, super diplomatic,
super Swiss,
we should talk about 13.
Right.
Yeah. We didn't talk about 13, Devil You Know, and definitely like Technical Ecstasy, Never Say Die, the last two of the Aussie era as well. But they're not going to really win either.
I don't think they're going to be down there.
I don't think 13 is going to factor in either. I mean, a lot of people were not crazy about it, and I kind of agree. I found it not believable.
Right.
I found it just like a little bit. You can't go back to that magic of the creativity of the, you know, when I'm arguing with buddies about this stuff, it's like I almost feel like Bill Ward should have been in the band, but should have wrote most of the album, because he's the guy with the solo albums that are the most fearlessly creative out of all these guys. So,
well, let's go to 13. Obviously, the most recent and probably final Sabbath record of all time, produced by Rick Rubin. Derek Westra, what about 13? My favorite Sabbath record is self-titled. However, 13 had some great gems. I think it was a perfect album to end their wonderful career. God Is Dead will be timeless in my opinion. Heavy Metal Heretic, 13 is not their best album, but it's a damn good metal album. Better than a lot of the stuff that came out in 2013. And Delicious Dishes, The Horsemen Continue to Ride, 13 is an amazing last record to have, and a giant surprise. Back in 2013, they went out with a really good one. What do you think about 13?
I just find it, I don't find the lyrics believable. The production I wasn't crazy about. It just felt like they were grasping. There was the slow part and then the speeding up part, like trying to write epics, and it just seemed kind of all forced. So something just bothered me about 13. I found the album with Dio just had a little more integrity to it. The last album.
At the risk of being devil's advocate, I mean, It was better than I was expecting, and I guess because I always have a healthy amount of skepticism about sort of quote unquote big return albums, because the expectations are set so high that unless it's one of the best of all time, it's going to be seen as a failure. Yeah. There are some very solid songs on that record. The production is massive. I thought it did actually a very good job of a songwriting that was very classic, that harkened right back to here, and yet it was done with a modern production. And I thought, rather than say, in my opinion, a Heaven and Hell, which is maybe chasing a bit, they managed to retain their sound, but still sound like they fit in 2013. Not a great record, and it's certainly not consistent, but I think I liked it a little bit better than you.
I think so.
Okay. Yes, Lisa.
Are we really going to make a top 5 Black Sabbath album that doesn't include the debut album?
It might just happen. I mean, what are people saying? It's also not going to include Sabotage, Martin. You may not be able to sleep tonight. No. I'm going to move these down.
I'm really doubting this one the most out of that.
I'm really doubting it as well. This is the surprise.
Yeah.
Dehumanizer. Never would have imagined going into today's show that this would even be in the top 10.
We talked about generations, though, right? I mean, depends how old people are when they enter into Sabbath. Like this could have been the first album someone ever bought, but by any band, let alone Sabbath, right?
That's right.
So there's the magic of discovery, right?
Yeah, you take a Maiden example. You get people who come in. The first album they know is Seventh Son, or the first album they know is Brave New World. And who are we to criticize? Yeah. That's your entry point, and the impact of that first record is hard to deny. I'm really taking issue with this not being there instead of that, but I'm going to let it go. I swear. Let's go back to the board. Mikhail Lopez says the self-titled is essential. Needs to be in the top 5. Without the song Black Sabbath, metal would not exist. That's the best argument. Kyle Kittleberger, take Dehumanizer out and put Sabbath Bloody Sabbath up there? Come on! People are coming to my defense here. Zachary Nathanson says Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is number 1. Please put SBS as number 1. Martin and Sam. Oh boy, do we get to pull rank? Here, let's go back to the first one. Semantics, maybe. This is arguably the birth of the metal sound.
Yeah. Don't
know if this is a metal record. And I think maybe that's an argument for it not to be up there.
Pretty metal. I mean, it's pretty metal. I mean, the first, like we say, it's got Wizard and NIB and Black Sabbath, and it's heavy enough, I think. But as a great album, it just fits in that proggy Vertigo thing, hard rock, prog, acid rock thing. But it is the most important album on this.
I don't know if you can, in good conscience, move this in and suggest that the first 3 are 3 of the best 5. You're making a big statement there. And again, I will hold that it is essential. None of us would be here without this record, but I don't know, as a record, as an artistic statement, as looking at it as a whole, it's nearly as strong as those other 2. Now, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, on the other hand.
But awesome record.
I'm reticent to move it in because what's going to move out? You've got a real concentration. Then you've got sort of this era, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, Dehumanizer. Lisa, did we just was that an invasion?
Well, the last 2 there knocked it out for Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. Go for it.
Okay, let's hold the board. We're holding the board. We got a few minutes left. Quater Massix says, I think the debut should be in the top 5, even if it's not 100% heavy metal. It's still the spark that ignited the fire. Good point. Claes Isaacson, take Dehumanizer down, replace it with the first album. Okay, here they go. Ben Fitz, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath was a daring, groovy masterpiece that brought heavy metal to new places. It belongs in the top 5. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath needs more recognition. So many good songs, versatile, and the best artwork. Come on. Galius says on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, the band. Okay. I'm pulling rank.
No, this one, right? Aren't you taking this one?
I'm going to argue that this is how it should look, based on what people are saying. Now, are the Dehumanizer masses going to come out of the woodwork?
There we go.
And suggest that we've effed it all up?
If you're not going to allow me this baby here, that's looking pretty good now.
Okay, let me shuffle the deck here. Bear with me. Vanna White is at work. Some of you too young to get that reference, I'm sure, but there we go. How are we feeling now?
That's pretty nice.
Talk to me.
That's sweet.
Sabbath, Opener, Master of Reality, Paranoid, Heaven and Hell, Sabbath. I mean, that's pretty damn good. We got these in the wrong order, but man, that's looking probably a little more accurate,
I think
in my
the
opinion.
chat rules is happy with Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath making the cut.
Good. Finally got some friends here on Lock Horns. We got a few minutes left, Lisa. Is the line still open on the telethon here?
A little bit, although the people arguing for mob rules, you're a little bit late, mate. Like, that ship has sailed.
Yeah, the mob should have arrived a little bit earlier if you want to rule this.
That works, looks good, looks pretty good.
Are we going to entertain the idea of picking the top one?
We have to.
Sure, let's
That's
do
what
it.
we do.
All right,
Let's
well,
do it.
then I think we would do this. We would probably put Master of Reality at the top.
I would do that, yeah, absolutely. Out of all those, these are my two favorite, and that's really an amazing record. So heavy.
It is a good record.
Yeah.
People seem happy.
We got, we got the populism. We've got Dio.
Yeah.
We've got the prog Wakeman multi-instrumental era.
Yeah.
And a great album cover. We've got the start of it all.
Yeah.
And then arguably we have, the third record in where they've, arguably crystallized their sound.
Sure.
Perhaps exhibiting the best balance of the ethereal with the heavy, exhibiting that kind of classical folk influence, but also coming up with some extremely memorable tracks.
There it is.
There it is.
Top 5.
Are we going back to the board for any more?
The board is cut.
The board has been cut off.
The board has been cut off because we
Okay.
need to talk about the future of Black Sabbath before we wrap up.
Okay. Future of Black Sabbath. Is this the end?
Well, I mean, they keep, rumbling about even playing the odd one-off gig, the odd, a special gig here and there. I don't feel that this lineup really has the appetite for another studio album, but there's been talk of Tony working with Tony Martin again, because Tony Martin, I guess they always kind of had a chemistry together, and Tony's a great singer and a little younger, from a younger generation. So I could see him doing some stuff there. He could do another solo album. He's done things together with Glenn Hughes, with Ian Gillan. He's done solo album. He's done the one where he had all the different singers.
Right.
So Tony seems the most into it out of all of them in terms of wanting to remain creative. Geezer was always the guy who was always complaining about everything. That's sort of like the joke about Geezer, that he just complained, and I could see him wanting to retire the most.
Right.
Ozzy, I don't know if he wants to retire, but Ozzy's got this great other band called Ozzy Osbourne, which if he needs to feed that, the urge to be out there and the adulation and to make more records, he could go that whole route. So.
And maybe there's a parallel with Rush here. I think there's a suggestion that we're not going to see a tour, but I don't think they've ruled out the possibility of coming back for some one-off shows, much like the Rush guys have said. And you know what? Here's an idea. Bring back Bill and do a show.
Absolutely.
That's all I'm going to say. But, never say die, I suppose, might be a good way to go out, because you never know what these guys could have up their sleeve. But there you go. I mean, the most important metal band of all time, Master of Reality, won for best Sabbath record of all time.
Sure.
Followed by, in no particular order, self-titled debut, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, Heaven and Hell, and Black Sabbath. Paranoid. Thank you, sir.
Sure.
I'm out of breath.
Hey, that was
Good
fun.
job.
That
I
was
think we're happy
absolutely
for
fun.
a change.
Sure, yeah.
We're not.
No.
It's not easy.
No.
We're pretty grumpy about our metal. Thank you, Lisa, Daniel, Craig, and Andrew. We're going on a hiatus from Lockhorns. Next week, we return the following week, but we're moving to Thursdays. That's right. Lockhorns will now be on Thursday, and we're going to return to debates about the heavy metal family tree, and we're going to tackle one of the most contentious branches on the tree, which of course is grunge. Is it metal? Is it not? And to help me with that debate, of course, is Liam Cormier from the Cancer Bats. So thank you for joining us. Keep locking horns. Subscribe to Banger TV. See you next time.